So today we're talking about manhwa tropes I cannot stand and honestly needs to go. I read a lot of manhwa in my free time and I try to keep an open mind and keep in mind that maybe I'm not the target audience for some of them. However, in my opinion, some of these tropes are nitpicks that I have for the genre, and some of these other tropes I'll be mentioning are straight up harmful, and I want to be able to discuss them. Disclaimer before we get into the video, I will be talking about sensitive topics regarding sexual assault and slavery, and I will be making those topics under timestamps so that those who'd much rather avoid hearing about them can skip them. The timestamps for said topics are going to be showed up here. Now, this trope is more like a pet peeve, but I do kind of hate it when the reincarnated villainous main character is suddenly able to switch up and become the nicest person you've ever met the next day. Vibes changed and everything. Personally, I prefer it if there were genuine stakes at changing her personality, and some manhwa do this, by either using like a game system that restricts her speaking style and actions so that changing up is much harder. But when some manhwa take away the added stakes or consequences, it doesn't take much for her changed behavior to start getting the attention of the people around her. And because of that, it feels unearned, and it feels like the villainess's previous actions don't really hold that much weight to begin with. Mind you, that villainess was probably torturing her mates and harassing everyone in her vicinity before getting reincarnated. So having that quickly be resolved without any lingering grudge or resentment from the people around her kind of takes away the consequences that should have been had, even if it feels unfair to the person inside the villainess's body. The second trope I can't stand is women in manhwa who essentially only exist to make the male lead look good or act as competitions and obstacles for the female lead, essentially existing to tear other women down. One of the reasons I especially dislike this trope is how straight up outlandish it can be. My problem is when the only reason why they are evil is because of a man. Some of these women have literally no identity outside of being competition for the female lead. Some of these characters will go out of their way to find the pettiest ways to get to the female lead. And it's always played in a way that lacks subtlety. It's clear that this character is so badly written, and her schemes are so obvious that the story has to bend over backward to make sure the audience knows she's evil and she's jealous and she's out to get the female lead. And some of these characters will genuinely spend time plotting to ruin the female lead's reputation because, I don't know, she looks too good, or she catches the eye of a duke or something, and the story will explain her entire master plan to us like we're kids, like we're babies. Like, sure, subtle humiliation and shady comments and spilling wine on a female lead's dress will surely destroy her reputation and social standing. When the female lead walks in, the female lead will quite literally figure it out immediately and then act accordingly and triumph because of it. Like, she can just read minds. And this is where I start getting annoyed because the story doesn't even give these women the dignity of being competent villains. They're just there to make the female lead look smarter, prettier, kinder, more popular, and more deserving by comparison. And sometimes the female lead doesn't even get to resolve the conflict herself. The male lead has to swoop in, expose the villain, fix everything, and call her out. And because of that, the story quite literally manages to make both women look incompetent. And what I would love to see is a female rival who actually is a proper rival. She has her own ambitions, her own relationships, legitimate grievances, maybe grudges against the female lead for actual problems that have been had. Like, damn, give her an actual goal. Give her a reason to want something outside of a man. Give her motivations that don't revolve around the protagonist. Like, girl, get a hobby. This is a bit of a nitpick, but the maids and servants in these stories are usually two things. Either really nice and only supportive of the main characters, or genuinely straight up abusive. My main issue with them is that they're oftentimes written almost like a prop, as most things in these stories tend to be, let's be honest. But while one only exists to be eternally thankful and nice to the female lead, the other is essentially used as a cheap obstacle to show that her life was kind of sucky. Especially in the beginning of these stories. Like, damn, y'all really be getting away with anything at this point. poisoning a noble's food is crazy work, even if you don't like your employer or that noble. That's crazy work. But personally, I'd love to see stories where the maids and servants genuinely have lives of their own alongside the main leads. And for these characters to have real depth to them, make mistakes, maybe get redemption arcs, maybe act in ways that don't always benefit the main characters. And if not, at least make them act more professionally. So this trope is pretty common in storytelling, even outside of Otome, Isekai, and Manhwa. And it's the surprise, they're secretly royalty, or, you have noble blood in you this entire time because apparently being the protagonist wasn't enough, I guess. And I get why it works. It's an easy way to make your protagonist important without having to establish why they deserve power in the first place. And you don't necessarily have to spend as much time establishing why this person deserves political power or why everyone should suddenly care and respect them. You can just reveal that they're secretly a lost princess or a descendant of some royal family, and suddenly everyone has a reason to take them seriously for once, and to actually see them as a threat. And to be fair, this trope is not necessarily bad, it's been used in storytelling forever, but my problem is when it essentially replaces everything the character accomplished beforehand. Like, your protagonist will quite literally spend the entire story going through character arcs, proving herself over and over again, but suddenly, oh, by the way, you're actually royalty. And because of that, everyone now has to treat her differently because of her bloodline. And I'm just, what was the point of everything that she just went through? Because now the story feels like all of those accomplishments were nice, but the real reason why she deserves this is because she was born to the right family. And it kind of reminds me of an old political idea, the divine right of kings, where someone's right to rule is treated as inherent because of their birth or divine authority. Obviously, a fantasy romance revealing that your protagonist is secretly royalty isn't necessarily the same thing. It's kind of similar. And personally, I think it's much more satisfying when the character's royal bloodline creates more problems rather than magically solving old ones. Like, think about it. This should be more of a burden than if she weren't a princess or weren't, secretly special. Because being born important and earning importance are two very different things. And I would rather see a character spend 100 chapters proving herself and be special because of what she did, rather than have that be ruined by some cheap, actually she was special the whole time. The next trope I wanted to talk about is the way that children are portrayed in manhwa. Manhwa children are oftentimes written less like actual children and more like cute little emotional support accessories for the adults. What do I mean by this? Most of the time, these kids have little to no opinions of their own and essentially act like an extension or copy of their own parents, and if not that, they act like a cheap plot device. Especially when the child's entire personality revolves around loving the main characters, forgiving them, validating their relationship, or conveniently resolving some family conflict that ultimately doesn't actually matter and is forgotten later on in the story. While the story is not explicitly telling you to have children, the way that parenthood is being presented as this incredibly tidy, emotionally rewarding accessory to a happy ending, I'd go as far to say it's giving pro-natalist propaganda. Next point. Another manhwa trope I honestly can't stand is certain manhwas that could easily be wrapped within 30 to 40 chapters being dragged out for 70 to over 100. And most of the time, there's no good reason for it either. Most times when readers start an otome manhwa, they tend to expect that the main central conflict that's being introduced gets built towards a satisfying conclusion. But when that gets dragged out with another 60 extra chapters of misunderstandings, side villains, random insertions about demons and fairies and another random kingdom we've never heard about and don't really care about, the story quickly loses momentum and interest. And the story starts to feel like every new arc only exists to delay the ending. And that's very, very annoying. I cannot stand that. A story with a dynamic and a plot that could easily be handled in 30 to 40 chapters, I want it to be done in 30 to 40 chapters. Stop dragging it. I want a tight script. Is that so fucking hard? Sorry, I'm getting kind of mean, but I'm serious. Is a tight script really that hard? Damn. Now onto the next trope. People are relatively familiar with the aggressive POC male character. But I want to go a little further on this because a trope I absolutely cannot stand is when a tan/POC male character is made out to be either a player, overly sexual, or is straight up fetishized in ways that don't really make sense. On one hand, yes, they are usually hot, and I'm not one to complain about that. I do love an attractive man. That's not necessarily the problem. But it is a problem when those traits are essentially the only reason he's considered attractive, and he provides no other actual benefit or value to the story. Now, examples of these are when the character's only appeal is presented through his body/clothes rather than his personality. The dialogue regarding him is constantly emphasizing his different cultural backgrounds, maybe even pairing it up with how his culture is known to be barbaric. And normally these characters are always paired up with a stereotypically whiter/paler, more innocent, and more fragile counterpart, which honestly makes it worse. Because now the darker, foreign-coded guy gets to be the experienced, dangerous, sexually aggressive one, while the pale character gets to be innocent, delicate, or refined. And now listen, I'm not saying a darker skinned male character can't be hot, flirtatious, or sexually confident, but there is a point where it actually transgresses into fetishistic or maybe orientalist territory. This one's a little more serious. Slavery in manhwa has been a widely discussed topic for a long time now, but what I really can't stand about the trope is how the topic is treated in the story as a whole. For example, Remarried Empress's handling of the slavery trope and Rashta essentially villainizing a slave character trying to survive in a political hellscape by any means necessary. But then you contrast it with how the story continuously praises and uplifts Navier for being such a great empress, even though she hardly does anything about actual systematic problems like slavery. But that's just my opinion. This is only really one example, but seeing how certain otome isekai manhwas treat buying or saving a slave as a next step for their own goals, and also reaping the benefits of a society that profits off slavery, is something I kind of wonder why we don't call out and think more critically about as a community, even if the main characters do treat the slaves well. Now, this one can be especially controversial, not in a way that it shouldn't exist entirely, but in a way that how it's talked about and handled. And I say this because there are stories that actually treat these topics seriously and do it well. Now, manhwas with themes of sexual assault do still exist and probably always will because there is a target audience for it, as messed up as that sounds. But I'm not here to judge. But what I can't stand is stories depicting it in ways that glosses over its horror or doesn't take it seriously. I personally like to skip over scenes like these when I do come across them, but seeing how it is hardly ever talked about and handled properly afterwards kind of makes me wonder, damn, do we really never consider the reality of topics like these? Because I think in stories like these, it would be actually really interesting to touch on the kind of trauma that comes out of these, like feeling like you're never clean after, the impending dread and disgust you have for yourself and for your abuser when you're near them. And these stories tend to omit themes like these because it makes justifying the romance between the characters much harder. And erasing these kinds of consequences makes it much easier to actually push the main couple together in the end. And because of that, stories are quite literally avoiding what could genuinely be an interesting take on the kind of reality that these victims have. And in the end, the perpetrator is forgiven without any real painful consequences. I would really love to see some jail time. Now, this is not necessarily a trope, but it is a symptom of terrible writing. And it's a really easy way for a decent story to be ruined with a really bad ending. And if the story isn't just ruined by a bad ending, it can be ruined even further with an even worse message behind it. I'm gonna try and find the manhwa title after this, and I'll flash the title on the screen if I do. But if I don't come after me. But for example, when a story not only glosses over a coercive version of sexual assault, acts like the relationship full of lies is no big deal, portrays the perpetrator as a pitiful character when the female lead has a perfectly valid reason to abandon him, you would think they would at least handle it better. But after all that, you end up with the children that came out of this, telling the female lead to get back with the perpetrator, who still lied to the very end, mind you, to, and I quote, stay together for the kid's sake. At that point, I knew it was a wrap. It also didn't help that the male lead was tan / visibly POC character. This was one of the more egregious endings, but I honestly don't have much else to say, but make it stop. Make it stop. Straight up. Cut the cameras. That's pretty much all the tropes I have for today, but at the end of the day, these are just my opinions on the genre and the parts of it that I wish were handled better. Like, some of these stories could have genuinely been good if they had a tighter script or simply didn't just do every single cliche in the book. But there's a reason these tropes exist, and I highly doubt that they're going anywhere. I'm still going to enjoy manhwa regardless. But I hope you enjoy my little rant regarding the genre, and I'd love to go more in depth with some of these stories in the future. If that's up your alley, feel free to drop a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again soon.